The Blackwood Mansion incident. What would you do if you discovered that the very foundations of your town were built upon the screams of innocent children? Tonight, we descend into the twisted corridors of Blackwood Mansion, where a century-old secret has been waiting to emerge from the shadows. What we uncover will make you question everything you thought you knew about the quiet suburbia that surrounds you. In the fall of 1923, 17 children vanished from the streets of Millbrook without a trace. There were no ransom notes, no bodies, no witnesses, only empty beds and shattered families. The police investigation led nowhere, and eventually, the case was shelved. But what if I told you those children never really left town? What if they had been waiting, trapped in a nightmare that spans generations? Dr. Eleanor Blackwood was the most respected physician in Millbrook, a woman who dedicated her life to helping children. Her mansion on Elm Street was known throughout the community as a place of healing and hope. Parents brought their sick children to her, trusting her completely with their most precious possessions. She was particularly known for her work with orphaned children, taking in those whom no one else wanted. But behind the mansion's immaculate white walls and perfectly manicured gardens, something far more sinister was unfolding. Dr. Blackwood had developed an obsession with what she called preserving innocence. She believed that children were corrupted by the world around them, and that the only way to keep them pure was to stop them from growing up. The mansion's basement had been converted into an improvised laboratory where Dr. Blackwood carried out her twisted experiments. She had convinced herself that she was saving these children from the cruelties of adult life by keeping them in a permanent state of childhood through a series of horrific medical procedures. The children were kept in small, cell-like rooms, their growth stunted by malnutrition and experimental drugs. Local records from the 1920s paint a disturbing picture of Dr. Blackwood's gradual descent into madness. Pharmacy logs show increasingly strange orders of chemicals and medical supplies with no legitimate use in treating children. Other doctors in town began to notice that children who visited Dr. Blackwood's mansion often returned changed, quieter, more withdrawn, with a strange look in their eyes that suggested they had seen something no child should ever witness. Mrs. Catherine Winters, whose 8-year-old son Timothy was among the first to disappear, later told investigators that her son had been acting strangely for weeks before his disappearance. He spoke about Dr. Blackwood's special games and mentioned other children who lived in the mansion's basement. When she asked him about these children, Timothy would become agitated and claim that Dr. Blackwood told him never to talk about them with adults. The timeline of the disappearances shows a clear pattern that the 1,923 investigators somehow overlooked. The children would begin by visiting Dr. Blackwood for minor ailments, then start spending more and more time at the mansion. Parents were told the children needed extended treatment, and gradually, the visits would turn into overnight stays. Eventually, the children simply never came home. What made the disappearances even more disturbing was that Dr. Blackwood had an explanation for each one. She told parents that their children had been sent to a special facility in another state, or that they had been adopted by wealthy families who could provide better care. She always had official-looking documents, and spoke with such authority that grieving parents rarely questioned her explanations. The first signs that something was terribly wrong appeared in the testimonies of children who managed to escape before disappearing entirely. 7-year-old Mary Henderson managed to flee the mansion during one of her treatment sessions and arrived home crying hysterically. She told her parents about the children who can't move in the basement, about cold, dark rooms where other children lay motionless in small beds. She described the smell of chemicals and medicine that filled the air, and the sounds of crying coming from the walls. But when Mary's parents confronted Dr. Blackwood, she calmly explained that the girl had had an adverse reaction to a new treatment and had experienced hallucinations. She presented medical documents detailing Mary's condition and recommended that she be sent to a specialized institution for her own well-being. Dr. Blackwood's medical authority was so absolute that Mary's parents, confused and afraid, agreed to send their daughter away. Mary Henderson was never seen again after being transferred to the supposed institution. Her parents received occasional letters allegedly from Mary, but the handwriting was oddly uniform and the descriptions of her new life were vague and repetitive. Years later, when the truth was uncovered, it was found that these letters had been written by Dr. Blackwood herself. The pattern repeated again and again. Children who showed signs of resistance or who tried to tell the truth about what was happening in the mansion were quickly transferred to distant institutions. Families, trusting the word of the respected doctor, never questioned these arrangements. Dr. Blackwood had created a perfect system of silence and control. Medical records from the time reveal that Dr. Blackwood had been experimenting with lethal combinations of sedatives and paralytics. Her notes, written in a code that would not be deciphered until decades later, detailed how she kept the children conscious but immobile for long periods. She believed this was necessary for what she called the transition, a process that would supposedly preserve their innocence forever. Dr. Blackwood's transformation from respected physician to sadistic monster was not sudden. Her fellow doctors began noticing subtle changes in her behavior during the months leading up to the disappearances. She began obsessively talking about the corruption of youth and the need to protect childhood purity. Her conversations became increasingly erratic, filled with references to unconventional medical theories and dark spiritual practices. Dr. James Morrison, who had been a close friend of Dr. Blackwood, would later recall how she had begun to express disturbing ideas about the nature of childhood. She started talking about children as if they were fragile objects that would break upon contact with the adult world, he recalled in a 1924 interview. She said that the only way to truly preserve innocence was to keep children in a state of eternal youth, even if it meant the unthinkable. Dr. Blackwood had been stockpiling strange medical supplies for months before the first disappearances. Local pharmacy records show orders of formaldehyde, embalming chemicals, and experimental drugs that had no legitimate medical use. When questioned about these orders, she claimed she was conducting advanced research on preservation techniques to assist other doctors in their post-mortem studies. The mansion itself had been modified to accommodate Dr. Blackwood's sinister activities. She had built a system of underground rooms connected by narrow tunnels, creating a labyrinth beneath the main structure. These rooms were equipped with medical tables, restraining devices, and ventilation systems capable of pumping sedative gases or preserving chemicals as needed. The children who remained in these underground chambers were subjected to a carefully calibrated regime of terror. Dr. Blackwood had studied the psychological effects of isolation and sensory deprivation, and she used this knowledge to break her victims' wills. She kept them in alternating cycles of total darkness and blinding light, feeding them minimal portions of food laced with mild sedatives. The preservation process Dr. Blackwood had developed was a grotesque combination of modern medical techniques and ancient occult rituals. She had studied Egyptian mummification practices and combined them with her knowledge of modern chemistry to create a method that would keep the bodies intact for centuries. But even more disturbing was her belief that this process would also preserve the souls of the children, keeping them under her control forever. In the final weeks before her death, Dr. Blackwood had been feverishly working to complete what she called the Great Work. Her journals describe a growing obsession with the idea of creating an army of innocents who would serve her for eternity. She believed that by preserving enough children, she could create a spiritual force that would allow her to extend her influence beyond the borders of Millbrook. The events that led to Dr. Blackwood's death on the 16th of December, 1923 remain a mystery. She was found in her underground lab, apparently having died of a heart attack while performing one of her rituals. Her body was surrounded by the 17 preserved children, arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be an improvised altar. The expression on her face was one of absolute terror, as if she had seen something that frightened her to death. The 1,923 investigators catalogued the scene as the laboratory of a madwoman, but were unable to explain several disturbing aspects of what they found. The children's bodies were perfectly preserved, as if they had died moments before, despite some having disappeared months earlier. The temperature in the underground rooms was several degrees colder than the rest of the basement, and there was a strange quality to the air that made investigators feel dizzy and disoriented. Even more unsettling, several investigators reported hearing strange sounds while documenting the scene. They described barely audible whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and occasionally the sound of children crying or softly laughing. These sounds were dismissed as effects of stress and fatigue, but official reports show that multiple investigators experienced similar phenomena. The official investigation concluded that Dr. Eleanor Blackwood had been a serial killer who had murdered 17 children in a series of twisted medical experiments. Her death was ruled a suicide, although no evidence of poison or self-inflicted wounds was found. The children's bodies were returned to their families for burial, and the mansion was sealed and later demolished. But the story did not end with Dr. Blackwood's death. In the years that followed, residents of Millbrook began to report strange incidents. Children would wake in the middle of the night, claiming that other children were trying to get them to come play forever. Parents would find their children's toys rearranged into patterns that matched the formation of the bodies found in the basement. The Thompson family, who had recently moved into a house built on the former mansion's garden site, began to experience what they initially dismissed as typical childhood nightmares. Their 7-year-old daughter, Emma, began to talk about her new friends, who only came out at night and wanted her to join their games in the basement. Mrs. Thompson first became concerned when she found Emma sleepwalking in the basement at 3 a.m., standing perfectly still in the center of the room with her arms at her sides, staring blankly at the wall. When she tried to wake Emma, her daughter spoke in a voice that did not sound like her own. "Dr. Blackwood says it's time to play. She says we've been waiting so long for new friends." The sleepwalking incidents escalated quickly. Emma would disappear from her bed multiple times per night, always found in the same position in the basement. But what terrified her parents the most was that Emma would speak during these episodes, holding conversations with invisible children, planning games and activities involving staying forever and never growing up. Other families in the neighborhood began to report similar incidents. The 5-year-old son of the Martinez family began drawing pictures of children in old-fashioned clothes, claiming they were his underground friends. The drawings showed disturbing details that no child should know, including medical instruments and underground chambers. The Hendersons' daughter began refusing to sleep in her own room, claiming the children tapped on her window and asked her to come out. When her parents investigated, they found small handprints on the outside of the window, but no footprints in the soft earth below. Dr. Patricia Wells, a child psychologist who was called to help the affected families, noticed a pattern in the children's behavior. They all spoke about the same 17 children, describing them by name and appearance with remarkable consistency. The children they described matched perfectly with the missing children from 1923 down to the clothing they had worn when they disappeared. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a paranormal investigator who had heard about the Blackwood case, came to Millbrook to study the phenomenon. What she discovered through her research was that Dr. Blackwood's ritual had been incomplete when she died in 1923. The spirits of the children had been bound to the location, but they needed living children to complete the circle and release them from their eternal torment. Dr. Mitchell's investigation revealed that the 17 children were not evil. They were trapped, desperately trying to find a way to move on to what comes after death. But their attempts to communicate with living children were being interpreted as invitations to join them in eternal childhood. Through extensive research in the town's archives, Dr. Mitchell discovered that Dr. Blackwood's death had been sudden and unexpected. She had been found in her lab on the 16th of December, 1923, apparently having died of a heart attack while performing one of her rituals. The timing suggested she had died before completing whatever process she had been working on. Medical records from the time showed that Dr. Blackwood had been in perfect health, making her sudden death suspicious. Dr. Mitchell theorized that Dr. Blackwood's death had been caused by the very spiritual forces she had been trying to control, and that her incomplete ritual had left the children's spirits in a state of limbo. The investigation took a disturbing turn when Dr. Mitchell discovered that the disappearances had not stopped in 1923. Town records showed that children had continued disappearing from Millbrook at regular intervals over the decades, always in groups of 1 or 2, never enough to draw attention. The pattern suggested that what Dr. Blackwood had begun was still ongoing. Dr. Mitchell interviewed elderly residents who remembered the original disappearances, and their accounts painted a picture of a town that had been living in denial for decades. Many admitted they had suspected something was wrong with Dr. Blackwood, but her reputation and authority had made it impossible to question her actions. The true horror came when Dr. Mitchell realized that Dr. Blackwood's spirit was still present, still performing her twisted experiments from beyond the grave. She had been using the trapped children as a means of luring new victims, planning to complete her ritual with a new generation of children who would be easier to control than the original 17. Through seances and spiritual communication, Dr. Mitchell made contact with the trapped children and learned the truth of their situation. They were not free to move on because Dr. Blackwood's spirit kept them imprisoned, using them as bait to lure new victims. The children were desperate to escape, but powerless against Dr. Blackwood's spiritual control. The children communicated through Emma Thompson, who had become their primary conduit to the world of the living. Through Emma, they told Dr. Mitchell about the other children who had been taken over the years, and about Dr. Blackwood's plan to create an army of eternal servants who would help her continue her work. Dr. Mitchell learned that Dr. Blackwood's spirit had been growing stronger over the decades, feeding on the fear and innocence of the children she had trapped. She had been using the children to influence the living world, causing accidents and incidents that would bring more children under her influence. The investigation revealed that several unexplained child deaths in Millbrook over the years had been caused by Dr. Blackwood's spirit. She had been slowly building her collection of eternal servants, planning for the day she would have enough power to expand her operations beyond the town's limits. The climax of the investigation came when Dr. Mitchell attempted to perform a counter-ritual to free the children's spirits. She had spent weeks researching the specific type of spiritual binding Dr. Blackwood had used, and had developed a method to sever the connection between the children's spirits and the mansion site. The ritual required Dr. Mitchell to put herself in spiritual danger by making direct contact with Dr. Blackwood's spirit. She would have to confront the mad doctor in the spiritual realm and convince her to release the children, find a way to break her power over them. As the ceremony began in the basement where the bodies had been found, the temperature dropped dramatically, and the room filled with the sounds of children crying and screaming for their parents. The spirits of the 17 children began to manifest, their forms flickering between the innocent children they had once been and the tortured souls they had become. Emma Thompson, who had been brought to the basement against her will by some invisible force, began to rise into the air, her body rigid and her eyes white. The 17 children materialized around her, their faces no longer frozen in terror but filled with desperate hope. They reached out to Emma, not to harm her, but to transfer their spiritual energy to her so they could finally find peace. Dr. Blackwood's spirit appeared as a towering figure of darkness, her form shifting between the respected doctor she had been in life and the monstrous entity she had become in death. She spoke in a voice that echoed throughout the chamber. "You cannot take them from me. They are mine. I saved them from the world's corruption, and they will serve me forever." The battle between Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Blackwood's spirit was both physical and spiritual. Dr. Mitchell used every technique she had learned about spiritual combat, while Dr. Blackwood wielded the power she had gained from decades of tormenting innocent souls. But just as Dr. Mitchell was about to complete the ritual, she made a shocking discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Dr. Blackwood's journal, written in a code that had taken weeks to decipher, was the truth about what had really happened in 1923. Dr. Blackwood had not been a madwoman conducting twisted experiments. She had been trying to save the children from something far worse. The town of Millbrook had been built over an ancient burial ground, and in 1923, something evil had awakened. The children weren't disappearing because of Dr. Blackwood's obsession. They were being taken by an ancient entity that fed on the innocence of youth. Dr. Blackwood had discovered this truth when she found the first victim, a child whose body had been drained of life force but showed no external wounds. She realized that the only way to save the children was to hide them from the entity, and the only place it could not reach them was in death itself. Her experiments had been desperate attempts to kill the children quickly and painlessly before the entity could claim them. The ritual she had performed was not to bind their spirits to the mansion, it was to hide them from the ancient evil still roaming the town. The children had been trapped for nearly a century, not by Dr. Blackwood's madness, but by her sacrifice to protect them from a fate worse than death. The coded entries in the journal revealed that Dr. Blackwood had been in contact with other protectors in different townspeople who had discovered similar ancient evils and were fighting to protect the children from them. The network of correspondents had not been fellow practitioners of child sacrifice. They had been a secret organization of guardians trying to stop an ancient evil from consuming the world's children. Dr. Blackwood's final journal entry, when properly decoded, read, "The entity grows stronger each day. I have saved 17 children from its hunger, but I fear there are not enough of us to stop it. If I fail, if it takes me, I pray that someone will understand what I've done and continue the fight. The children must be protected, even if it means becoming a monster in the eyes of the world." When this truth was revealed, the ancient entity that had been feeding on Millbrook's children for centuries finally showed itself. It materialized in the basement as a twisted mass of shadows and whispers, reaching toward Emma Thompson with tendrils of pure darkness. The entity spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The protector is gone. The barriers are broken. The children are mine to claim." Its form shifted and transformed, showing glimpses of all the children it had consumed over the centuries, their faces contorted in eternal agony. Dr. Mitchell realized that Dr. Blackwood's spirit had not been imprisoning the children, she had been protecting them from the entity. The spiritual binding was not a prison, it was a shield that had kept the ancient evil from claiming them. By trying to free the children, Dr. Mitchell had inadvertently weakened the protective barrier that had held the entity at bay. The entity began feeding on Emma Thompson's life force, its tendrils wrapping around her and drawing her essence into itself. The 17 children watched in horror as their potential savior was consumed by the very evil that had threatened them for so long. But Dr. Blackwood's spirit was not finished. She had been conserving her strength for this moment, waiting for the entity to reveal itself so she could make one final stand. She materialized between the entity and Emma, her form glowing with spiritual light as she channeled all her remaining power into one last protective barrier. "You will not have her," Dr. Blackwood declared, her voice resonating with the authority she had commanded in life. "You will not have any of them. I have spent a century learning your weaknesses, and I will use that knowledge to destroy you." The battle between Dr. Blackwood's spirit and the ancient entity was a clash of spiritual forces that shook the very foundations of reality. The basement filled with blinding light as the two entities fought for control over the children's souls. The 17 children, no longer bound by Dr. Blackwood's protective ritual, were free to choose their own fate. They could move on to what comes after death, or they could join the fight against the entity that had threatened them for so long. One by one, the children made their decision. They joined their spirits with Dr. Blackwood's, creating a combined force of innocence and protection that the entity could not overcome. Their combined spiritual energy formed a barrier the creature could not penetrate, and for the first time in centuries, it began to weaken. The battle was brief, but intense. The children's spirits, empowered by their righteous fury and the love they had for one another, overwhelmed the ancient entity. Timothy Winters, the first child to disappear, spoke for them all. "We choose to fight. We choose to protect. We will not let you hurt any more children." As the entity was destroyed, its death cry echoed through the spirit realm, alerting other guardians around the world that one of the ancient evils had finally been defeated. The children began to fade away, their faces finally at peace as they moved on to whatever comes after life. Dr. Blackwood's spirit approached Dr. Mitchell one final time. "Thank you for understanding," she said. "Thank you for helping them make the choice I could never give them. They are free now, and they chose to be heroes." Emma Thompson woke up in her own bed the next morning with no memory of the night's events. The strange occurrences in Millbrook ceased immediately, and the town returned to normal. But those who had witnessed the truth doctor, Mitchell, the Thompson family, and the few others who had been present during the final ritual knew that sometimes what appears to be evil is actually the greatest act of love. Today, a small memorial stands in the park, built over the site of Blackwood Mansion. It bears the names of the 17 children who disappeared in 1923, and a simple inscription, "In memory of the children who sacrificed their rest to protect the innocent." Dr. Eleanor Blackwood's name was quietly added to the memorial 5 years later, when the full truth of her actions came to light. She had given up her reputation, her sanity, and ultimately her life to save the children from a fate worse than death. Her journals, now properly decoded, revealed a woman who had made an impossible choice with courage and love. The ancient entity that had terrorized Millbrook for centuries was never identified, but similar disappearances in other towns built over ancient burial grounds suggest that Dr. Blackwood's story may not be unique. Perhaps there are others like her, making impossible choices to protect the innocent from evils most of us will never know exist. Dr. Mitchell continued her work as a paranormal investigator, but she never forgot the lesson of Blackwood Mansion. She established a network of researchers dedicated to identifying and fighting similar ancient evils, ensuring that other protectors like Dr. Blackwood would never have to face such horrors alone. But Millbrook's story did not end with the destruction of the entity. In the months following the final ritual, more details emerged about the true nature of the evil that had plagued the town. Historical archives revealed that child disappearances in the area stretched far beyond 1923, spanning centuries of fragmented records. The Native Americans who had lived in the region before the arrival of European settlers had legends about a devourer of youth that would emerge from the earth periodically to feed on the tribe's children. Their protection rituals and purification ceremonies had kept the entity dormant for generations, but the construction of Millbrook over their sacred land had disturbed these ancient seals. The construction of Blackwood Mansion specifically had been the event that fully awakened the entity. The home's foundation had been dug directly over what tribal records described as the heart of eternal hunger, a place where the entity had been buried for millennia. Dr. Blackwood, unknowingly, had built her home directly over the prison of an ancestral evil. The first signs of the entity's presence appeared subtly. The gardens around the mansion began to wither without reason, and animals avoided the area entirely. Mansion staff reported recurring nightmares about children crying beneath the earth, and several quit after claiming they had seen small figures moving in the shadows at night. Dr. Blackwood initially attributed these phenomena to the stress of her intensive medical work, but when she began noticing her young patients behaving strangely after visits, she realized something supernatural was happening. The children spoke in their sleep about the hunger in the dark and drew pictures of shadowy creatures reaching from beneath the ground. The entity's first true victim had been an orphaned boy named Marcus, who had been living in the mansion under Dr. Blackwood's care. One morning, he was found in his bed, apparently sleeping peacefully, but completely lifeless. There were no signs of illness or injury, but when Dr. Blackwood examined the body, she realized something fundamental had been extracted from the child. It was as if his very essence had been absorbed, leaving only an empty shell. It was at that moment that Dr. Blackwood began researching historical records and contacting other doctors who had reported similar cases. She discovered a network of correspondents who had secretly been documenting sightings of similar entities in different parts of the world. These guardians, as they called themselves, had been fighting ancient evils for generations, sacrificing their reputations and often their lives to protect the innocent. Dr. Blackwood's correspondence with these guardians revealed the true magnitude of the threat. The entities were not demons or evil spirits in the traditional sense, but fragments of a primordial consciousness that had existed before humanity. They fed specifically on innocence and purity, making children their ideal prey. Once they began feeding in an area, their presence grew exponentially, attracting more of these entities until the entire region became uninhabitable. The methods Dr. Blackwood developed to preserve the children had been refined through decades of collaborative research with other guardians. The process was not only physical but spiritual, creating a barrier around the child's soul that the entity could not penetrate. However, this required that the children be maintained in a specific state between life and death conscious, but immobile for the protection to work. Dr. Blackwood's decision to proceed with these methods had not been made lightly. Her journals reveal nights of moral agony, struggling with the horrific choice between allowing the children to be consumed by the entity or ending their lives to save their souls. She ultimately concluded that spiritual preservation was preferable to the complete annihilation that awaited them if the entity claimed them. The ritual Dr. Blackwood had been performing at the moment of her death had been a final desperate attempt to permanently seal the entity. She had gathered all the children she had preserved, planning to use their combined spiritual energy to create a barrier that would last for centuries. However, the entity had sensed her intentions and struck before she could complete the process. Dr. Blackwood's death had been caused by the spiritual shock of making direct contact with the entity without proper protection. Her sacrifice had partially sealed the creature, but it left the children trapped in a liminal state, neither fully dead nor able to move on. For decades, they remained conscious but powerless, watching as the entity slowly regained its strength. The other guardians around the world had lost contact with Dr. Blackwood after her death, assuming she had failed in her mission. However, they had continued monitoring the Millbrook area, noticing that child disappearances had continued but at a much slower rate. They hadn't realized that the preserved children's spirits had been actively interfering with the entity's efforts to claim new victims. Dr. Mitchell's investigation revealed that the 17 children had been using all their spiritual energy to protect other children for decades. Each time the entity attempted to take a new victim, the spirits intervened, creating the nightmares and strange behaviors reported by families. They were trying to warn living children about the danger, but their communications were interpreted as terrifying supernatural phenomena. The children's final release required not just the destruction of the entity, but also the resolution of decades of spiritual trauma. Each of the 17 children had to confront their own fears and pain before they could find peace. Dr. Mitchell served as a mediator in this process, helping each spirit process their experience and consciously choose their final destiny. Timothy Winters, the first child to disappear, had also been the spiritual leader of the others during their time trapped. He had maintained hope and organized the children's efforts to protect others, even when it seemed they would never be freed. His strength had been crucial in keeping the other children united through decades of spiritual confinement. Sarah Mitchell, the girl whose desperate letters had been found in the basement, had been the one who finally managed to make contact with Emma Thompson. Her ability to communicate with the living had been strengthened by her desperate desire to warn other children about the danger. Through Emma, she had at last been able to tell the true story of what happened in 1923. The other children had each contributed uniquely to the resistance against the entity. Some used their energy to create illusions that confused the creature, while others worked to strengthen the spiritual barriers Dr. Blackwood had established. Together, they had formed a protective network that had saved countless lives during their time in captivity. The entity's final destruction had only been possible because the children had willingly sacrificed their chance at immediate peace to fight one last time. This decision exponentially increased their spiritual power, creating a force the entity could not resist. Their choice to fight had been motivated not by vengeance, but by a genuine desire to protect other children from suffering their same fate. After the final battle, each of the 17 children had a personal moment with Dr. Mitchell before passing on. They expressed gratitude not just for their release, but for finally being understood and honored for their sacrifices. For many of them, this recognition had been as important as the release itself. Dr. Blackwood had been the last to depart, waiting until all the children had found peace before allowing herself to rest. Her final conversation with Dr. Mitchell revealed the depth of her suffering during decades of being misunderstood and demonized for her actions. Her greatest pain had not been her ruined reputation, but the possibility that other children might suffer because of a lack of understanding about the true nature of the threat. The effects of the spirit's release extended far beyond Millbrook. The global network of guardians reported an immediate decrease in the activity of similar entities, as if the destruction of the Millbrook creature had sent shockwaves through the spiritual realm. Other ancient evils appeared to have retreated temporarily, possibly re-evaluating their own vulnerabilities. Millbrook's story became a case study for paranormal investigators worldwide, but it also served as a warning against judging the actions of others without fully understanding the circumstances. Dr. Blackwood had been the victim of an impossible situation, forced to make choices no person should ever have to face. Dr. Mitchell's files were later studied by other researchers, who identified similar patterns in cases around the world. It was discovered that many historical figures who had been demonized for seemingly evil acts had actually been fighting supernatural threats that the general public had never known existed. The memorial in Millbrook became a place of pilgrimage for families who had lost children under mysterious circumstances. Many reported feeling a sense of peace and protection while visiting the site, as if the spirits of the 17 children were still watching over the innocent. The Thompson family, especially Emma, continued to be monitored by Dr. Mitchell for years after the events. Emma displayed an unusual ability to detect supernatural presences but never again experienced the traumatic episodes she had endured during the crisis. She appeared to retain a residual connection to the spiritual world that allowed her to serve as an early warning system for similar threats. The other children affected by the events also showed lasting changes. Many developed heightened sensitivity toward children in danger, often gravitating toward careers in social work, education, or child protection. It was as if their experience with the spirits had left them with an inherent mission to protect others. Subsequent investigations revealed that the Millbrook entity had been only one of many that had been hibernating beneath human-built sites. Modern urban development had inadvertently disturbed numerous ancient seals, releasing evils that had been contained for millennia. Guardians around the world realized they were facing a growing crisis that required international coordination. Dr. Mitchell established a foundation dedicated to researching and combating these supernatural threats. The organization operated in secrecy, recruiting individuals with special sensitivities and training them in spiritual protection techniques. Their work saved countless lives, even though the general public never knew the true nature of the threats they faced. The methods developed by Dr. Blackwood were refined and improved by the new generation of guardians. They found ways to protect children without requiring the extreme sacrifice she had made, using spiritual protection techniques that kept children safe while remaining alive and conscious. However, Dr. Blackwood's legacy served as a constant reminder of the sacrifices some had made to protect the innocent. Her story became an example of how true heroism often requires decisions that are misunderstood or condemned by those who do not fully grasp the circumstances. The residents of Millbrook gradually began to understand the true nature of what had happened in their town. The families of the missing children found comfort in knowing that their children had been protected and honored, even in death. Dr. Blackwood's reputation was fully rehabilitated, and she became a revered figure in the community. The anniversary of the spirit's release became a day of remembrance in Millbrook, not only to honor the 17 children and Dr. Blackwood, but to remember the importance of protecting the innocent no matter the personal cost. The annual ceremony included readings of the children's letters and excerpts from Dr. Blackwood's journals, ensuring that their story would never be forgotten. The influence of the events extended through generations. Children who grew up in Millbrook after the spirit's release showed an unusually high rate of careers in fields involving the care and protection of others. It was as if the residual spiritual energy of the 17 children had imbued the community with a lasting sense of responsibility toward the vulnerable. Paranormal investigators continued to study the site for decades but never detected any negative supernatural activity. Instead, many reported a sense of peace and protection that seemed to emanate from the memorial park. It was as if the children's final victory had permanently purified the area, turning it into a spiritual sanctuary. The story of Blackwood Mansion became a case study in paranormal research institutes around the world. It demonstrated that the reality of the supernatural was far more complex than most people understood, and that the true monsters were not always the ones who appeared obviously evil. The descendants of the families affected by the original events maintained connections with Dr. Mitchell's foundation, serving as a support network for future investigations. Their knowledge, passed down through generations, became a valuable tool in identifying and combating similar threats in other communities. Modern technology allowed later investigators to analyze the site with methods unavailable in previous decades. Electromagnetic studies and spiritual energy measurements confirmed that the area had been permanently altered by the events, creating a protective zone that extended for miles around the memorial. Blackwood Mansion may have disappeared physically, but its legacy lives on in the safety of Millbrook's children. And sometimes, on quiet autumn nights, residents report seeing a woman in a white coat walking through the park, keeping watch over the town she died to protect. The children who were saved that night grew up to become teachers, doctors, and protectors themselves, carrying on the mission of safeguarding innocence without even knowing why they felt so compelled to help others. The spiritual sacrifice of the 17 children had created a lasting impact that would protect future generations. The truth about Blackwood Mansion reminds us that evil often wears the face of good, and that the greatest heroes are sometimes those willing to be remembered as villains. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood saved 17 children and an entire town from an ancient evil, and in doing so, proved that sometimes the most sinister events are actually acts of the deepest love. Millbrook's story became a case study for paranormal researchers around the world, a reminder that the supernatural realm is far more complex than simple tales of good and evil. It showed that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those trying to save us from even greater horrors. So the next time you hear a story about someone who seems to be a monster, remember the children of Elm Street and the woman who loved them enough to be hated for a century. Because sometimes, the scariest truth is that the real monsters are invisible, and the people we fear most are the ones trying to save us from them. The Blackwood Mansion incident remains a testament to the power of sacrifice, the strength of innocence, and the lengths to which love will go to protect what matters most. In a world where ancient evils still lurk in the shadows, it reminds us that there are always those willing to face the Darkness 7 if it means becoming darkness themselves. And perhaps that is the most sinister truth of all, that in our quest to protect innocence, sometimes we must sacrifice our own.